Hello, I'm John Smeaton, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Family and Life Academy and to the third lesson in our abortion course. The topic of this lesson is eugenics in the history of legalized abortion. Our presenter is the acclaimed scholar and author Anne Farmer. Anne Farmer's lesson will document the eugenic motives which have propelled campaigns for legalized abortion in various parts of the world. Anne Farmer is a writer, poet, illustrator, and researcher. She has authored a number of books, including Language of Life, Christians Facing the Abortion Challenge, Prophets and Priests, The Hidden Face of the Birth Control Movement, and By Their Fruits, Eugenics, Population Control, and the Abortion Campaign. At the end of the lesson, Anne Farmer will answer any questions you may have, which you can put in the window at any time during the lesson. I will now hand over the stage to Anne Farmer and to her lesson on eugenics in the history of legalized abortion.
John, many thanks for your introduction. Hello, my name is Anne Farmer. Welcome to my lesson on abortion and eugenics. Introduction: the hidden history. To the casual observer of modern day culture, eugenics is something horrible that thankfully is now behind us, while abortion is essential to female health, happiness, and most especially equality. Histories tell us that eugenics was embraced by the political right, most notoriously by the Nazis, but is now shunned, while abortion was banned by both church and state, although despite this, it is said that backstreet abortion was rife. Consequently, left-wing radicals and feminists fought to reform the allegedly cruel abortion laws, which impacted most heavily on poor women. Abortion advocates now use euphemisms like the right to choose, abortion rights, and abortion care, while avoiding the reality of abortion, the actual killing methods, the disposal of the unborn, the effects on mothers and on all those involved. The mainstream media follows suit, ignoring the influence of eugenics on the abortion campaign. However, not only is there a link between abortion and eugenics, but the campaign for legalized abortion actually originated in the eugenics movement. I explore these sinister roots in my book, By Their Fruits, the result of many years' research in the archives of the Eugenics Society and those of Britain's leading abortion campaign, the Abortion Law Reform Association, ALRA, whose papers are held in the Eugenics Society's archives. I also have a personal angle on this history. Both my parents came from large, poor families in the East End of London, and I have had mentally disabled family members. This lesson aims to give the broad outline of that history, but also to show the hugely influential part eugenics still plays in society, most especially through abortion. What is eugenics, and who were the neo-Malthusians? Eugenics, meaning well-born, was coined by Sir Francis Galton, polymath scientist and cousin of Charles Darwin, in 1883. Galton and his followers believed the race was deteriorating because the unfit were having too many children, that the fit, broadly speaking, the better off, should be helped to have more children, while the unfit, broadly speaking, the poor, should be sterilized. Their philosophy could be summed up as scientific snobbery. Campaigning for contraception were the neo-Malthusians, followers of Parson Thomas Malthus, the 18th century clergyman who warned that humanity would outrun its resources if not restricted by war, famine, pestilence, and disease. Malthus's theory was the inspiration behind the workhouses, grimly depicted in Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist. They were still operating in the 1920s, when my father's family spent time there and where his little sister died. He always vividly recalled he and his brothers being separated from their mother and sisters at the workhouse door, in accordance with Malthusian theory that the sexes should be segregated to prevent the poor from multiplying. However, whereas Malthus advocated self-restraint in their sexual matters, his 19th century neo-Malthusian disciples were atheists who promoted birth control with obscene literature, claiming that overpopulation caused unemployment, hunger, and war. The neo-Malthusian movement was tiny, centering on the wealthy Drysdale family, and the eugenics movement was composed largely of the well and the wealthy. What marked both campaigns, however, was hostility to religion, or superstition as they saw it, an obstacle to their campaign. Both movements lost impact during the Great War. With thousands killed on the battlefield, it was not a good time to warn about overpopulation, but their fortunes revived thereafter. The neo-Malthusians warned against post-war birth booms. Visiting England in 1947, American birth control campaigner Margaret controversially called for a moratorium on British births, ignoring the fact that couples were merely making up for lost time, that a new birth represented a vote of confidence in the future against the dismal prophecies of the population controllers. The origins of the abortion campaign. The 1930s saw the eugenics movement spawning numerous campaigns aimed at eliminating mental unfitness, from contraception to euthanasia, from marriage guidance to divorce, from sterilization to abortion. The emphasis on so-called voluntary sterilization was a neat fiction, since mentally disabled and sick people would not be able to give authentic consent, while under their own theory, anyone intelligent enough to recognize their own inferiority should not be sterilized. The abortion campaign ALRA was founded by two wealthy women, Alice Jenkins and Janet Chance. Their focus was on the poor, but poor women especially regarded birth control associated with decadence and prostitution as an affront to their dignity, while abortion was seen as an appalling crime against innocent life. ALRA claimed that legal abortion would eliminate backstreet abortion, while birth control campaigners claimed that contraception would prevent backstreet abortion. However, the birth control movement was also composed of eugenicists and neo-Malthusians. Marie Stopes, a leading figure, was also a eugenicist who called for the sterilization of those totally unfit for parenthood to be made compulsory. She said that utopia could be reached in my lifetime with the power to legislate compulsory sterilization of the insane, the feeble-minded, revolutionaries, and half-castes. Most supporters of the campaigns for birth control, abortion, sterilization, and euthanasia supported all approaches to curbing population. However, promoting abortion alongside the contraception that was supposed to prevent it would have raised suspicions as to campaigners' real motives. In reality, failed contraception increased demand for abortion as the planned pregnancy led to the unplanned pregnancy. Significantly, Marie Stopes and her counterpart, Margaret Sanger, while condemning abortion, discreetly referred women for it. The birth controllers faced public opposition on the grounds of indecency, but the sterilization campaign was hampered by laws passed to segregate those who are really mentally deficient in special hospitals, but also in some cases the mothers of illegitimate children, meaning that they would not breed, so would not need to be sterilized or be provided with fertility control. Of course, the truly mentally disabled were unlikely to reproduce anyway, but the eugenicists wanted to sterilize their families in case the unfit family produced any more mentally disabled members. And winning acceptance for abortion was even harder, since the atheistic Soviets had legalized it after the Russian Revolution. This measure so affected the population that in the 1930s, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin introduced restrictions, although tellingly, eugenics abortions were still permitted. During the 1930s, the so-called enlightened Nordic countries passed their own abortion laws. All were based on eugenic sterilization programs, some of which targeted ethnic minorities and continued long after the war. As in England, the Swedish emphasis was on so-called voluntary sterilization. Doctors would be forced to participate, but far from learning the ethical lesson from this today, a woman's right to choose is seen as trumping a doctor's right to choose not to perform abortions. Now, English abortion campaigners enjoyed close links with Swedish eugenicists despite the compulsory sterilization program. In fact, because of it, English campaigners also admired Nazi Germany's sterilization movement, with Stopes the most notorious example of Hitler fandom. And historical sterilization scandals continue to emerge even today. During the 1930s, the abortion campaign succeeded in raising alarm about backstreet abortion via the British government's Burkitt inquiry. Itself strongly influenced by eugenics, ironically, this public inquiry failed to increase demands to legalise abortion. Instead, it led to calls for more help for expectant mothers to enable them to avoid backstreet abortion. However, the eugenics movement could count the Bourne case involving an abortion on an underage rape victim as a success in changing the law. This test case involved Dr. Alec Bourne, who much later became a member of England's first pro-life campaign, the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, and it permitted doctors to perform abortions in certain narrow circumstances. But the campaign to fully legalise abortion failed, largely because innocent human life was still seen as sacrosanct and abortion as a wicked or desperate act. In the Hungry 30s, the labour movement saw abortion as an existential attack on the working classes, and rightly so, for according to wealthy Malthusians, the poor had votes without responsibility. In the meantime, the eugenics movement expressed dismay at Catholic involvement in the Labour Party, seeing it as an obstacle to their aims. The writer G.K. Chesterton suggested that eugenics was derailed by the Great War. With its huge loss of life, it also highlighted the courage of the supposedly unfit, thus overthrowing eugenics assumptions. Sadly, eugenics did return, but later the Holocaust would expose the evils of sterilization, and public interest in eugenics waned as the Nazis dealt a catastrophic blow to the idea. Irremediably tainted, eugenics became a dirty word, helping to push the movement into temporary obscurity. But although the Holocaust claimed millions of victims, it did not kill eugenics. During the 1960s, it re-emerged as a campaign for a solution to unfitness that, unlike sterilization, had escaped the taint of the Holocaust: abortion. Fortunately for eugenicists, few were aware that abortion had been employed by the Nazis against other ethnic groups and those they regarded as inferior. Indeed, abortion featured in the Nuremberg trials held by the Allies after the war as a crime against humanity. And in 1967, the Liberal MP David Steele's abortion bill was passed with active encouragement and help from Labour Home Secretary Roy Jenkins. Unlike in the 1930s, many Labour MPs supported it against a background of overpopulation scaremongering, as well as the Eugenics Society's privately expressed concerns about race mixing, the result of wartime relationships with the American troops. And as ALRA's co-founder Alice Jenkins put it, because of Irish immigration, there was a danger of Rome reconquering England. Just as significant were concerns about disabilities caused by the drug thalidomide, prescribed for morning sickness, but also a famous case in Liège, Belgium, the infanticide of a disabled child. Framed as a compassionate measure to save women from backstreet abortion, David Still's bill appealed to libertarians, but with its focus on disability, it also appealed to eugenicists. During the 1960s, the Eugenics Society embraced a policy of crypto-eugenics, enabling them to covertly pursue the same aims through family planning, more accurately, family banning. For in 1945, under the Eugenics Society's secretary C.P. Blacker, the focus switched from more children from the fit, fewer from the unfit, to smaller families for all. However, the real target was the poor, since Blacker had defined the eugenic family as a small Malthusian family and eugenics as family planning. Blacker, a psychiatrist, founded the International Planned Parenthood Federation, the IPPF, with Margaret Sanger, who was responsible for developing the contraceptive pill and made no secret of her views on the inferiority of the non-white races, specifically aiming birth control programs at them. Neo-Malthusians like Blacker and Sanger, both abortion supporters, claimed the solution to overpopulation was contraception, but this boosted demand for abortion, and far from egalitarian, the new eugenics meant targeting the financially unfit. This was eugenics population control, and despite claims that having fewer children made poor people richer, it was better nutrition, healthcare, and housing that lowered the infant mortality rate, helped people live longer, and naturally lowered the birth rate. As to the financially fit, they preferred material possessions to children. As well as impacting most heavily on poor women, the 1967 Abortion Act specifically allowed abortion for the unfit baby. The time limit was 28 weeks, determined by viability, but in 1990, a law permitting embryo experimentation lowered this to 24 weeks, but exempted disability abortions, since when these have been allowed even when the baby is in the birth canal. Eugenics and abortion today, disability. It might be supposed that after the Nazis, any public policy smacking of eugenics would come under scrutiny. However, under the welfare state, the poor became expensive, and in the 1960s, the cost of caring for the disabled was raised by abortion campaign pioneer Alice Jenkins. In those days, fetal disability was mainly gauged by prenatal exposure to infectious diseases. But the development of scientific tests led to intense medical pressure on expectant mothers to terminate. In 2012, the UK's introduction of non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT, led to even more disability abortions. Regardless of the official obsession with equality and diversity, the deaths of the different represent a saving to the state, although a welcome spotlight has been shone on the inequality involved in aborting disabled babies up to birth by a legal challenge from Heidi Carter, who has Down syndrome. Eugenics also permeates artificial fertility assistance, with would-be parents selecting the best embryos to be implanted. And the hugely profitable fertility industry actually encourages eugenics by lulling women into believing that they can put off childbearing, and thus increasing age-related infertility, and late motherhood holds a greater risk of fetal disability. The quality of embryos can now be assessed by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PIGD, and polygenic scoring which rates for intelligence as well as disease. But in a recent paper, Sarah Munday and Professor Julian Savulescu dismissed eugenics concerns because it would be a choice. Professor Richard Dawkins explained, "We practice eugenics when we screen for Down syndrome and other chromosomal or genetic abnormalities. The reason we don't define that sort of thing as eugenics, as the Nazis did, is because it's based on choice. It's about enhancing people's freedom rather than reducing it." Seemingly, Nazi-style selection of the fittest techniques do not count as eugenics if those offering it are not Nazis. And yet the Nazis regarded their targets as non-persons, while today's non-Nazis withhold human status from the unborn until they pass the fitness test. IVF has been described by the World Health Organization as a way of eliminating the disabled. Still, the issue is seen as one of freedom because despite infringing on the freedom of the unborn to live, or because they failed to pass quality control. Test tube eugenics was born in 1978, but much earlier than that, eugenicists explored the potential of controlled breeding for creating an improved human race, as in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Clinton Chance, wealthy stockbroker husband of abortion campaign pioneer Janet Chance, was concerned about the effects of racially mixed breeding, but also interested in euteliogenesis, the scientific separation of the sex act from reproduction. The right to procreate was enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but in Huxley's dystopia, the state bred human beings like animals in the required numbers and in the required categories. Eugenics and abortion today, population control. Blacker's new eugenics went global as family planning via the IPPF, but after scandals like the mass sterilization of poor people in India in the 1970s, population control was repackaged as help for poor women. With enthusiastic support from left-wingers, usually suspicious of population control, neo-colonialism was cloaked in the mantle of equality, with claims that to deprive women of fertility control was to deprive them of choice. And Hillary Clinton, who attended the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, in which pro-choice feminists willingly participated, notably failed to criticize China's compulsory one-child family program, notorious for depriving women of choice with forced abortion and sterilization. Feminism as the handmaid of eugenics. Some feminists are explicit pro-life, but are ignored by the population control movement in favor of the pro-choice feminists' reinvention of abortion as an issue of equality, all while failing to challenge the inequality intrinsic to disability abortion. With medical pressure to choose termination when disability is diagnosed, despite often unreliable tests, couples are given an invariably gloomy prognosis and no opportunity to consult families with disabled children. Abortion is framed as healthcare, although the chief danger is not the baby dying, but the baby living. These attitudes affect disabled persons after birth. Families with disabled children are quizzed about not having taken the tests. Declining them is seen as tantamount to inflicting suffering on the child. As in a Nietzschean transvaluation of values, protecting a less than perfect life is seen not as caring, but cruel. Even more disturbing, the same arguments used to justify aborting disabled babies have been used to justify infanticide because of the suffering they cause their mothers. Pro-choice feminists dress as Margaret Atwood's handmaids to protest abortion restrictions, but in fact, they are the handmaids to eugenics. Compulsion in the age of choice. The sexual revolution might be seen as a repudiation of eugenics. However, it depended on restricting fertility. Thus, eugenics only strengthened its grip on society, but under the euphemism choice. Increasingly, people's choices are shaped by eugenics as the availability of abortion as a solution to problem pregnancies has reduced alternative positive choices. Western nations appear to provide real choice by subsidizing single motherhood, but with the ever-growing cost of the welfare state, the poor have become even more expensive. With births dwindling, the aging population has become burdensome. Right to die laws are presented as just another choice, but just as the welfare state provided free birth control, eugenics welfare state will pay for death control for those regarded as burdensome. Equality, diversity, sustainability, and eugenics. The same governments that preside over practical eugenics pride themselves on equality and diversity, seemingly the very antithesis of eugenics. But their diversity preoccupation jars with a disproportionately large number of poor non-white abortions, both here and in America, as well as taxpayer-funded birth control programs for the poor non-whites of the world. We need look no further than the IPPF's and UNFPA's involvement in China's forced abortion program for one of the most egregious examples of the shocking views of eugenicists being put into practice. Meanwhile, Malthusianism has returned with a vengeance, with the rise of green politics and the emphasis on sustainability. While most people want to protect the natural world, leading environmentalists see human beings as burdens on the planet. Sir David Attenborough has even called humanity a plague on the earth. This has boosted the case for population control, and despite the obsession with Black Lives Mattering, poor Black Africans are the main targets of population control, although they can hardly be accused of overconsumption. Helping Africa to develop would bring prosperity and better health, but it would also undermine the eugenics idea, which depends on portraying the poor as unfit and in need of being managed by their superiors. At the same time, widespread population control in the West justifies the imposition of family planning on poor countries on equality grounds. In the West, self-sterilization is promoted to save the planet, and while hatred for children is openly expressed, human rights are demanded for crustaceans and even lakes. Against this background, drawing attention to the millions of unborn humans killed in abortion simply strengthens the case for population control, because the most zealous Greens would argue that abortion has prevented even worse environmental disaster. Globally, birth rates are declining, but the population narrative persists, as greater longevity leads to more and more people being alive to count. And to those who most love counting people, people don't count. To the Malthusian mind, population control has saved the planet from being swamped by humanity. But since many women have more than one abortion, far more babies are conceived than will ever be born. But as birth rates plunge and there are fewer workers to contribute to government tax coffers, it is population control that is proving unsustainable. However, the Stokes-Sanger wanted child model of childbearing reinforces the idea that children should not be born in less than perfect conditions. Conclusion: choice in the age of compulsion. Free welfare must be paid for, and the shrinking pile of taxes also subsidizes free contraception and abortion, a kind of taxpayer prevention program. And as such, the disabled, the poor, and the elderly may be regarded as not just nuisances, but expensive nuisances. Now we are encouraged to worship self because you're worth it. And selfishness has not only become a virtue, but an evangelical one, imposing its self-centered eugenics standards upon others seen as not worth it. Compulsory eugenics may seem far-fetched, but already there is a 2-child limit on some welfare benefits, and eradicating those with Down syndrome is viewed positively by some. Despite the increasing influence of woke notions of diversity, lethal discrimination against the different goes on apace. Far from a thing of the past, eugenics never went away. With the approval of liberty-loving radicals, it has survived to re-emerge as choice, and unless we acquaint ourselves with its growing influence on our enlightened world, we may see a return of full-blooded, compulsory eugenics. Far from dead, eugenics is still very much alive and killing. We have now passed the 10 million mark for abortions in this country, with abortion the biggest killer worldwide. There is no memorial to these innocent lives, but they could be seen as a memorial to our failure to learn the lesson from history, that when we dehumanize the helpless, it is all too often a preliminary to exterminating them. In the US, there is hope, however, with the reversal of the historic Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision of 1973, effectively returning abortion to individual states and the wishes of the electorate. And here in the UK, the legalisation of abortion pills by post as a safety measure during the COVID pandemic, an apparent gain for the abortion movement, highlighted the hypocrisy of 50 years of warnings that restricting abortion would lead to dangerous backstreet abortion. Now the government itself has reintroduced backstreet abortion with all its attendant dangers. Eugenics is all about breeding more intelligent humans, but the evidence points to humanity suffering not from a lack of intelligence, but a lack of wisdom, compassion, and most of all, humility. Sir Francis Galton was one of the cleverest of men, but was himself childless. He created a philosophy responsible for untold death and misery, while most individuals killed before birth would never start a war, commit a crime, or hurt anybody. They are guilty only of needing help. Even on its own terms, eugenics is a failed idea, but it is the failed idea that continues to beguile. Most human beings need good reasons to do bad things. Eugenics is a very bad reason to do anything, but now it has been redefined as choice. It is threatening to impose itself on everyone. The end.
We've got a number of questions come in, and the first one I have is, can you recommend good material refuting the claims of the neo-Malthusians?
Yes, I can actually. I could recommend James Delingpole, Watermelons, How Environmentalists Are Killing the Planet, Destroying the Economy and Stealing Your Children's Future. Nice long title. That came out in 2012. And also Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor and Fails to Fix the Planet, which came out in 2021. So they're both very good.
Wonderful, thank you. And here's another one. Someone asking, I've heard of programs in America which pay drug addicts to get sterilized. Are you aware of this or any other contemporary, quotes, voluntary, unquote, sterilization?
Yes, there have been a number. I mean, a number of the sterilization laws apparently are still on the books in the US, and at times they've tried to target female prisoners by offering them sterilization as a means of getting out of prison a bit earlier. So, which is not voluntary, obviously, because it's an incentive that's been offered to them. So yes, yes, it's still a temptation, and even more so, I think, because of the cost of in a welfare state as we live in, of subsidising the poor from taxation.
Oh, thank you, Anne. Here I've got a rather sadly topical question for you. The late Prince Philip is known to have expressed Malthusian views, and King Charles is known to be a radical environmentalist. Should we in the UK be concerned?
Yes, people might not know that Prince Philip, the late Prince Philip, was a founder member of the World Wildlife Fund, and but also, of course, he was well known as a huntsman. So it does seem a bit strange nowadays to think of the WWF being founded by people who actually enjoyed big game hunting and so forth. But in fact, and as they've become more and more involved in promoting the climate change approach, apparently he did drop his involvement a few years ago because of that. However, we have that on good authority. However, he still retained the view that the world was overpopulated, and took an active interest in that, as other members of the royal family have done, including Princess Diana, sadly, and have made statements on the issue. However, it's what we need to remember is that what we know now, and not very many people know this, but the roots of this campaign, where they came from, not many people know it, and the way that prominent people are encouraged to join these campaigns, and is because they're presented as non-political. They're presented as neutral. It's something like it's and as we know, the Queen herself was very careful to avoid controversy, and so that just we need to remember that that's how this the whole idea of the world being overpopulated. Many people still believe it. Many people still believe it, and the actual decline in births is hardly reported. But we still hear that the population is going to reach this fantastic figure, and you know, and so on and so forth, and linking it to the environment, and it's still very much mainstream thinking. And the very fact that it has been mainstream thinking for a long time, it's just like common sense. So that explains actually why members of the royal family have allowed themselves to be, I would say, what's a polite word, tempted into speaking out and having their names linked with this idea that the world is overpopulated. And you know, from their point of view, it was a very virtuous campaign, because the world was under threat, the natural world is under threat, and it, you know, and a lot of people, as I say, still believe this. And yes, so it's a very complex area, and it's very disturbing, but I wouldn't rush to condemn, because it's become such a mainstream idea, and is very seldom challenged by anyone in main who has access to the mainstream media and I'm trying to think of someone who has Bjorn Lomborg. He's a very he was a very prominent campaigner for the environment, but you don't hear so much from him lately. And also, actually, Greta Thunberg, who's been derided by many because of her youth, and but she's actually come out and said we shouldn't stigmatize people for having children, which I thought was a very welcome intervention. Although I have to say that more or less since she came out with that, we haven't heard so much from her. She was always, oh, Greta this and Greta that, and she knew everything. She's the teenager who knew everything. But then, it could just be a coincidence. But to my suspicious mind, the fact that she defended people having children and it shouldn't be demonized for it is
that's fascinating.
Yes, it's
Now I've got another question here. England was the home of eugenics.
It was, yeah.
Unlike most of North America and Northern Europe, Britain did not introduce compulsory sterilization.
No.
Why do you think this was the case? Our questioner asks.
Right. I personally, I think it was there's more than one factor involved. There were 2 mental deficiency acts introduced, which allowed for the segregation, if you like, for mentally deficient people, as they would define them, being placed into hospitals. Now that was quite a bad thing to do in many cases, and some of them were actually young women who had given birth to illegitimate children and were considered to be mentally deficient because of that. However, it had inadvertently, it suggested to people, and the English are very, very empirically minded. They don't go in for big ideas. They don't really like big ideas and ideologies and so forth, but they go by experience and reason. And they said, well, hang on a minute. I think this is probably what they said, but these people are already in hospital. Why do they need to be sterilized? And the impetus for that campaign kind of dropped, because there was no, you couldn't portray these so-called mentally deficient people as breeding uncontrollably, because they were in hospital. They couldn't anymore. The other factor, of course, behind that was that the Eugenics Society, of course, people who were actually insane, who were mentally ill, could be committed to an asylum. That had been going on for a very long time. But what they wanted to do was basically to define poor people, many poor people, as mentally deficient because they were poor. Because after all, if they couldn't manage their money, they couldn't manage their finances, there must be something wrong with them. And not only that, they kept having children. And how mad was that? To keep having children when you can't, when you're poor, that to them was absolute evidence that they were mentally deficient. They continued to have large families, therefore they were mentally deficient. So that their real aim was to actually sterilize anybody, the family of anyone who was committed to an institution, but also, anyone who showed evidence of being mentally deficient by having lots of children and not much money. So that was another, but also, as with the abortion campaign, their solution for this so-called problem of mental deficiency, it didn't actually chime very well with many people, especially on the left. I think that was crucial. Their interpretation was they're trying to get rid of us. They're trying to kill us off. And also quite right, because the neo-Malthusians were very keen to point out that, okay, you've given everyone the vote, but these people are just going to vote for welfare programs, expensive welfare programs. They won't pay for them, but you will have to. So, you know, we really need to restrict their numbers. So in that sense, democracy actually led to a reaction. The reaction to democracy was the neo-Malthusian movement and the eugenics movement. It was a reaction to democracy. And of course, the most direct attack on democracy is to kill people, because you're killing the voters. So there won't be so many people voting for these welfare programs. But of course, then the reaction to the eugenics and the neo-Malthusianism was the left-wing opposition, because they realized quite rightly that they were the targets. And many people in the Labour Party were Catholics. And it's said that the socialism in England, at any rate, owes more to Methodism than Marxism. It was very much the offspring of religious feeling. Very many people were religious. They were either non-conformists or Catholics, and so, you know, the Marxist idea. In fact, Marx was not a great fan of Malthus. In fact, he detested him. But a lot of that was to do with the fact that he placed his trust on the masses of poor people, to overthrow capitalism. That's what he saw as happening. That was going to be the inevitable result of, you know, after capitalism came the response to capitalism, which was to overthrow it. In fact, what has happened, as we can see, is that the poor people have not overthrown capitalism, and so the left has lost interest in the masses, really, and they've gone more for dividing people by, you know, you're in this box, you're in that box, you're that minority, you're this minority, and you're all, you know, all got different interests and so on. So that is really what has happened. Yes. So yeah, it's quite a complex.
It is complex. I mean, as you were speaking there, I was thinking this sort of civilized understanding of the poor, including their right to procreate, if you like.
Yes.
We wouldn't normally associate that in the modern era with the left.
No.
Or with any particular party, actually, either on the right or the left. So what period historically you're talking about? Is this the 30s, and what period are we talking about here?
Well, during the 30s, the left was very much, the Labour Party was very much pro-life, as we would call it. I don't think they would recognise 2022 if they were transported from 100 years ago. They would be absolutely appalled, I should think, that people are celebrating abortion and saying, oh, women need it to be equal, and the feminists would be appalled. Why? Why do women need to have their children killed so they can be equal? Haven't they got the vote? Yes, they've got the vote. Yes, they've got equal opportunities. But, you know, they would be absolutely appalled by this. And from what I can make out, this opposition to abortion continued on the left until as we know, the Soviets did legalize it in 1920, but they reined back on it to a certain extent because the revolution had been won. They didn't want the revolution to be overthrown. They didn't want to, So after that, millions died of starvation, millions were killed in abortion, but the masses didn't really count anymore. And so it went on, and English socialists, I should say very wealthy socialists, would go to Moscow, would see the model villages and say, oh, how marvelous it is. It's all working wonderfully. And yet millions had died of starvation. So they came back to England and said how marvelous it all was. And people thought, oh, well, perhaps this is the alternative. But by the 1950s, as Churchill said, the Iron Curtain fell across Europe in 1945. The Allies needed the help of Soviet Russia to win the war against Hitler. However, that strengthened the Soviet hand, and they occupied half of Europe. And but then something happened. The 1956 Hungarian uprising against communism, which was ruthlessly put down, and they couldn't hide it anymore. And from that time, it was no point that the Western left socialists saying, oh, how marvelous communism is, let's try it, because people could see how terrible it was. And also in the West, living standards were getting better for the poor. There was public housing, there was public medicine, there was public welfare, and there wasn't the high unemployment of the 1930s. And people thought, capitalism has got its good sides, providing us with jobs and so on. And we can see how terrible communism is. We can actually see it. We could see the Berlin Wall. And it's great. The Berlin Wall has come down now, but it's harder to fight a ghost. It's harder to fight because it can just be ignored. As we know, whatever doesn't fit the certain narrative gets forgotten and swept aside. So, as I say, back in 1956, that the Western socialists could no longer say how marvelous communism was. So what did they do? They went in for relentless criticism of the West without saying, oh, isn't communism marvelous? They just said how terrible capitalism was. And somebody said, I think, that North Korea, if you just go by complaints about free speech itself, North Korea must be a wonderful place because there's hardly any criticism at all. Whereas everyone's criticizing it must be terrible here because everyone's criticizing it. So getting back to the abortion thing, of course, that's another. Whereas the left here would be very appalled by any idea of sterilization. Abortion is not only okay, we need it. We need it for our freedom and our equality and so forth. So that's the difference. They would still be very, and population control. If you call it population control, they're against it. But if you call it abortion rights, they're all for it. So it's just just call it something else. Find a nice euphemism. Abortion care is a good one. Yes. As long as you don't talk about what you're actually doing, don't mention that. But so that's where we are at the moment, I'm afraid. But for every action, there's a reaction, and I think the more the more this idea is pushed that we need abortion, the more there'll be a reaction against that. I think the public will not buy it.
Very good. Well, we have got time for one more question. And it is this: was Russia influenced by Western eugenicists and neo-Malthusians in becoming the first country in the world to legalize abortion in 1920? Or did this arise more from Soviet ideology?
Right, yes, well, we did just touch on this, where Marx himself was hated Malthus and everything he stood for. And the emphasis was always on the masses, the masses, the masses. But of course, as we said, one of the first things that the Soviet revolutionaries did was to they introduced all the measures that we're familiar with now: the easy divorce, easy abortion, and so on. So, and in actual fact, they were influenced by the need basically to do what they wanted to do, and that was, you know, in most revolutionary sects, you'll find that abortion and basically immorality are essential. That's the top of their list. So and they've been notorious for this. And again, after the revolution's done. We don't need the masses except to tell them what to do. So if they have abortions, you know, it doesn't matter. They're not going to. That's not going to affect us. So that was part of it. It was the libertarian emphasis of the revolutionaries that was responsible for that. It wasn't the influence of Western eugenicists. In fact, it was the other way around. The Western eugenicists and Malthusians were absolutely blown over by the Soviet abortion program, if you will, the legalization. They absolutely were captivated by it. It didn't matter whether they were left wing, right wing. The most important thing was abortion, and that the Soviets had done it. And again, you know, the left wing radicals who went, the English people like I think the Beatrice and Sidney Webb went to Moscow, and various people went and were sort of schmoozed, as they say, by the Soviets and shown all the good things. And they thought this absolutely marvelous. But also, I mean, the right wing eugenicists were absolutely, thought it was great. And if only we could introduce such a system here. So, and they would publicize it, and also obviously not go into any of the gory details of how this wonderful idea worked. But they were absolutely bowled over by the whole thing. So strange reversal process going on there.
Yes. Look, well, thank you very much indeed. And that is all our questions answered. Thank you everyone for your participation today. The video of this lesson will be made available, as all our lessons are made available, on the Family and Life Academy website, along with study notes and other resources. We look forward to seeing you for lesson 4, which I'm presenting and which is entitled Tactics Used in the Worldwide Abortion Revolution. So heartfelt thanks once more to Anne Farmer, and you are our participants. We're very much looking forward to seeing you again.